Welcome everyone, my name is Patrick Hanson and I'm joined here with Peter Tait. This is our third and final segment of our conversation, creating consumer demand for geothermal. In our previous segments, we discussed how we got here, why we should care, and then we dove into the difference between the way geothermal industry, our industry, traditionally markets itself, and the prospect and concept of ingredient branding. In this final segment, we're going to talk about how, why, and who. So, Peter, can you explain to us how we go about doing ingredient branding, maybe from a tactical basis? And isn't this kind of expensive?
Well, if we were a group with the resources of Intel, then it would be, yes, we just go spend a ton of money on everything from Super Bowl ads on down, right? I assumed in developing the paper that wasn't us. And having done this for a bunch of startups, I've never had the luxurious position of having tens of millions of dollars to go spend on this kind of campaign. So there's a playbook that I found works. The first element is having a shared and aspirational story. And I feel like since I did the first version of the paper in February, this is coming together incredibly quickly on its own. So I don't think pulling together the shared story about geothermal is that hard. But the reason you want to do it, it's just like politics. We need a set of common talking points that people will use all the time and keep reinforcing, right? I could give some examples from the political sphere, but that will probably piss off at least some small percentage of whatever audience looks at this, so I'll leave that alone. But the idea that we need a common set of things, and you've in both of the other two segments you've said hashtag geothermal, and that's a perfect example of if everything has that attached to it, you start to build momentum. And I will say, perhaps a step zero, this is a long-term effort. This is not a campaign that you run and in one quarter you suddenly have visible results. This is actually a long haul. I think given the conditions we see in society at the moment, I think this can easily be an effort that sees enormous results in 2020. So it's not like it's 5 years out, but it's not, hey, we spent $20 and we ran a campaign for a month and nothing happened, right? It's a longer story than that. So that's the first step, it's the shared aspirational story. And I do think it's very important that all forms of geothermal, so deriving energy from the earth, I think geothermal across the spectrum has to all be included. And I want to take a sidebar for a second about why I think that's important. Solar has one really fantastic advantage, which is individual consumers can install it and do it themselves, right? So that was a big part of the growth of solar. It was not utility scale, it was individual people doing it. That made it a lot easier for the grassroots thing to happen.
Yeah.
But it also means it's something you can do. Now, replacing your heating oil in the Northeast with a geothermal heat pump system could well be a really great way to introduce the term geothermal and the notion and the idea and the value proposition to directly to end consumers. So we can't just think about this as power generation.
Right.
So that's the first step. Second step is we need to network our own extended community. And you and Alex have both been doing a lot of hard work in this area to get just this idea of hashtag geothermal. If everyone in this community starts following everyone else in this community and starts retweeting and sharing content, then I have an overlap between my tech marketing community and geothermal. So if I share geothermal social media content, it's exposed to a completely different non-geothermal group of people, right? Everyone has that network inside and outside the community. So sharing and amplifying our own story within our own group is important. And that's because we need to go through this geothermal community, then we need to reach the influencers and tastemakers, then we need to reach the enthusiast adopters, then we'll reach the early adopters, and then the mainstream will just come along for the ride later. We don't need to reach them right away, but we do need to get one step at a time. So we network ourselves and we start sharing each other's positive stories and narrative. Then we reach out to these influencers. And in my early research for the paper, I came across lots and lots of think tanks and groups publishing all sorts of analysis and research about the future of the energy supply, about climate change. And so we need to find a way to make sure that every one of those people has a buddy in the geothermal community, is one way to think about it. Or basically, we need to do the outreach of regularly briefing those people and giving them information and giving them access to resources that, and when I asked the other geothermal related person in this house about this idea, there was a lot of, well, yeah, we talked to that person once, but it's like, no, that's not the idea. These have to be regular conversations. And the world is changing so incredibly rapidly that a briefing you give someone or some information you give them now will be different in 90 days. So these have to be conversations that happen. Then there's the news media themselves. People like Sammy Roth, the LA Times, are writing great stories about geothermal. So those people need to be given regular briefings, and not formal briefings, but they need to have a conversation with us so that they understand the story we're telling. And then as we build this, we need to distribute concrete proof of success. And there are some great stories in geothermal already, and there have been over the last 25 years, but nobody's being told those stories. Yeah. Nobody's sharing them, and they're important now. And then we need to set up our own community members as thought leaders that are available to talk to these groups. One of the things I learned in doing PR for startups a very long time ago was that if I made myself available as a subject matter expert to have a conversation with an industry analyst, they would accept the meetings all the time because they got to ask me questions that furthered their research, and they would then provide insight to us. So it was a bi-directional conversation. So we need to some extent, we will need as a group to have something akin to a speakers bureau, where it's like, if you're a research think tank or a press person, there's somewhere you can go to find, I need a person who can talk to me about X to do with geothermal, right? Then we need to make it easy for other people to share and amplify our story. And that is this simple things like learning how to make it as easy as possible for the press to create and publish a story. And there's providing them the background research and helping them. Then there's being available to be interviewed and provide quotes. But even something as silly as stock photography.
Right.
In the paper, I refer to a fantastic story by Sammy Roth in the LA Times about the importance of geothermal. And yet the image that goes with it from the Salton Sea has in the foreground all these what look like piles of tailings from a mine that are in fact naturally occurring.
Right.
But the image makes geothermal look incredibly dirty and industrial and waste generating. Yeah. So we need as a community to find ways to make it incredibly easy for people to get really nice looking stock photography that helps the industry. And then the last thing is we harvest all of the stuff that comes out of this: news, results, technology, consumer reaction, and then put it back into the mill again. So this is building a continuous cycle machine, which is why my consulting operation is called Customer Engines. It's building machines to keep doing this is basically what I've been doing. All right, so that's how we do it at the highest level. Those are the steps we as a group need to do.
I think what's exciting or encouraging, and this conversation or our concerted efforts going forward will help push this further. The Geothermal Resources Council did start, I'm not sure how widespread it is yet, but they did start an ambassador program, which somewhat supports your thinking on like the coordinated effort of sharing the right message from industry thought leaders. In my opinion, that was incredibly well thought out. I'm not sure how well executed yet, but with it being run by an association, sometimes there's some constraints, either in the way you can get creative or how much you can push the envelope without alienating certain audiences. So I think this effort may actually take a more private sector, marketing-driven push, and it seems like that our industry is more open to that, embracing of that idea. So I'm excited about what is in store. I also want to plug our friend Alex Richter and his media company, Think Geoenergy. He has spent 10 plus years making that the most professional, comprehensive database, if you will, landing page for all things geothermal, and
Right.
he's growing monthly. So I believe that we are slowly but surely creating quite the repository of news, of photos, and have the groundswell, if you will, of people that are ready to spread the word. But I do think it's going to take people like you and I and others to really to light that proverbial fire and get things going. So this definitely sounds like it's going to require a coordinated effort. Who do you think is going to do this?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I had started off when I first wrote it. I was helping out with the GRC work and purely as a volunteer, and had looked at them as a likely core organizing principle or group. I want to be careful that two things that I think are critically important. One, this doesn't need to have someone in charge in the sense that it's someone who owns it and runs it per se, but it does need to have some organization and coordination. And as you pointed out to me when we first talked about this, Think Geoenergy is a natural place for a lot of the information to be shared. So, for example, someone needs to maintain this notion of the Speakers Bureau, of who do we go to, who's on tap to provide information, right? And so that feels like some organized group should be the holders of that thing, so that there's a central point of contact. But I'm completely agnostic on who it is. But one point I want to make that's critically important is that the communication we exchange and the information the story we tell has to be adding real value to the climate conversation. And we have to avoid self-promotion. I've worked in lots of organizations where, one of the first red flags if I walk into a new company is social media is outsourced to the PR firm. Because that tells you that, A, you can tell what you're going to be saying next Thursday, which means it's got nothing to do with the conversation going on in the marketplace. And B, if the content isn't created by people who actually can add value to the conversation, then what value is it to the recipients?
Right.
And so I have this very fundamental view of this social media-based interaction, which is people follow those who have something interesting and useful to say. So however we organize it, we have to have a few of these core functions, like maybe Think Geoenergy would be the perfect place to put the press resources, for example, of here's all the stock photography associated with it. But we are going to have to figure out who's going to maintain the notion of the Speakers Bureau, and then some shared sense of the list of who the influencers are that we need to be talking to and who's got the best relationship with them. Right. That could be done to begin with on a Google sheet or an Excel spreadsheet, but then it could grow into something much bigger. So at this point, I'm agnostic about who takes on the coordination, but the great thing is we can actually just start doing it without any coordinating group.
Right, and I think what's encouraging for us is a lot of the steps that we're trying to organize and make available have started to happen. The GRC is really getting with it from a branding and marketing and communication standpoint. Think Geoenergy is at an all-time high. Our collective interest as volunteers or carrying the torchers, if you will, there's momentum with Jamie Beard's Geothermal organization, the IGA, all the other respective associations around the world, Ring. There is such an upswell of people invested in making geothermal bigger and better thing. It just is going to require us to shift the focus, change the lens, whatever sort of metaphor you want to use to help them think that it's not just an internal discussion. We have to get my neighbor down the street the politician that's helping put together the next environmental friendly bill really understand the power of geothermal, and then, no pun intended, and then get our utilities to embrace us the way they've embraced solar and wind.
Right. And one of the things that I think we sort of skipped on the ingredient branding a little bit is that even if you go look at utility company websites, they will tout how much renewable energy they're switching to, because they've figured out that their consumers care about this. And as soon as you get to the point where the major economic players in the space perceive that their customers demand something, then we figure out how to go get it and how to make it happen. And we really just have to collectively as a community get this ball rolling downhill, but stop talking to ourselves and talk to other people. You know, when I started doing the research into this and I started to subscribe to various utility and industry newsletters, I pretty much needed Google Translate just to go through the acronym soup of understanding power contracts and understanding how this operation works. Well, that's not how consumer communication works. And if we think in terms of that Tesla model of be the envy of all of your neighbors and save the planet at the same time, and oh, by the way, it actually saves you money as well now.
Yeah.
It's that model. And, you know, people are starting to ship electric SUVs, but nobody says, where are you going to charge it in the middle of the Sierras?
Yeah.
It's like, well, I can have my cake and eat it too. It's just, you know, that's aspirational marketing that we need to engage in as a group. Yeah. All right. I think we
have our work cut out
for now.
Yeah, we have our work cut out for us. And over the last 3 segments, which I hope all of you have liked, I've taken some notes. And in the very first segment or early on in your paper, which again, I hope we can share with everyone soon, you mentioned that we need to imagine the best possible future role for geothermal and then develop the technology to make it happen. Or in other words, we need to picture where we want our industry to be in the next 5, 10, and 15 years from now and help position geothermal on that trajectory.
Right.
And I hope to be a part of that. And I think you and I share enough of the similar goals and passion for geothermal that I think we might be leading the charge here. Similarly, and probably just as important in terms of how this happens, is we need to embrace ingredient branding. And I believe ingredient branding will lead to a completely new approach in creating a buzz within the end user to begin demanding geothermal to be a part of their clean energy portfolios with their utilities. And that ultimately is the goal of this entire conversation, is how do we create consumer demand?
Yep.
And over time, whether that's 1 year or 10, it'll happen because climate change is real, and geothermal can be a major player in helping us take climate action. So, Peter, I'd like to turn it over to you for any sort of closing remarks before we ask people to like and share this video.
Thanks, Patrick. Something you just said is, I think, the really key takeaway, that in a lot of other initiatives that I've been engaged in, we start with what the vision's a term that is horribly misused in a lot of contexts, but if you start with what do you want the future to be like, what is the outcome you want, not what will we do in that future necessarily, but what will the future look like?
Yeah.
Then you work backwards to what do we need to do to be a meaningful part of that change. Then you go figure out how to make those things happen. And I think the risk with geothermal is that there's a perception that it's quite old. Like if I say I was running around in Wairaki in 1984, that's a long time ago.
Sure.
But one of the reasons I want to point out that we shouldn't think about price is that solar and wind have become incredibly inexpensive, but they were subsidized enormously to get off the ground, right? Oil was and still is subsidized, which is the craziest thing of all. So the idea that we need to compete on the non-level playing field is wrong, but we will make that future happen with geothermal if we get the other end of the pipe to pull on it and want it.
Right. That's critical.
Yep.
Critical.
I'm really excited you put this series together and that we've got this conversation going. So thank you for helping to.
Absolutely. I don't think this will be the last that you hear from us. Peter and I have a lot of things in common and goals to take both his paper and the concept of creating consumer demand to the next level. I can't thank you enough, Peter, for your time. What I'd like all of you to do that are watching this video and the other two is to like them, to share them with your extended networks, both in the industry as well as beyond. And not forget that solar and wind have a lot of money behind them, a lot of people and numbers. And geothermal needs to consolidate and group up together with the hot springs and the direct use and the ground source heat pumps and the power production. And then together we have numbers. So if we don't take anything else from this, it's that we need to come up with a similar and or like-minded series of speaking points and stay consistent with those. And over time, we will get geothermal not only to be synonymous with renewable energy such as solar and wind, but to be demanded by consumers. And again, I say this, it may sound cliche, but everything we do in an industry, whether we're sharing a news report from Think Geo, a company update, or a story that we like, we have to hashtag geothermal and any derivative of geothermal that's relevant, so people outside of our industry start seeing it.
Right.
So again, thank you, Peter. I hope you enjoyed this 3-segment series on creating consumer demand for geothermal, and this won't be the last you hear from us. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick. It was a pleasure.